Hello everybody and welcome back. Today we want to create, update and delete data using our API. To be able to do so, you should really understand how your API works. It might be different than you expected. So hence please use a tool like Postman to create put requests for changing data, to create post requests and to create delete requests. Only if you know what to send, you're able to implement it. So play around with those requests and what happens if you put an ID in which is different from the one above, or if there's no ID, or you leave out a parameter like image URL. Is it replaced with an empty string or is it kept as it is? So play around and know your API. So now we want to be able to edit data, add new person objects and delete it, and see how we can handle this. Delete and save will need a controller. According to our layered architecture, we will need a controller. In addition, we want to show those form fields pre-filled if I selected the edit button here, or empty if I selected the plus button here. Hence our state should be set to the object, person objects accordingly. So now is the question, how do we set this state? So for this form, our state is a person object. It's either one of those objects, if I press the edit button, or that's one way of solving the problem. You make a person object with ID -1 and empty fields here. Another thing is, as we use the future-based approach and not using streams, we need to invalidate the provider used here to force a refresh on change. So whenever we call delete or save, we need to invalidate the provider used here. As we access the backend, save and delete are handled asynchronously, and hence our state here should be an async value to have async data, async loading, or async error as possible states. And if we have data, it's a person object. So here I show you the approach, the solution I took to address the problems just described. Then after, I will discuss alternatives. So the controller for saving and deleting will make use of the repository provider we defined already in the last video. We will need methods, save and delete, where save encapsulates create a new object or update an existing object. The usual approach of controller is to have state and methods changing the state in the same class. So the controller holds a person object as a state, and we will handle a null person object in a way that it hides the form, and only if I have a person object it will be visible, it will be shown. More precisely, the state is of type async value person, and this person might be a null object. Doing so, we are able to handle errors of the backend, loading, and the data itself. And we will implement methods like editPerson or newPerson, which sets the state of this controller class accordingly. So whenever I press a button here, or the plus button, those methods will be called. And hence, of course, the controller must be provided. So we will use riverpod to provide this controller. And in case of any changes, to force a refresh of this list, we will invalidate the people provider. And one final thing to remember, independent of using providers, whenever you use those text editing fields, you will need text editing controllers, and you need to dispose these controllers. So have a quick look at the repository. We need to implement update person, delete person, and add person. So we call put, post, or delete methods, and depending on the data returned, which you know after using Postman what will be returned by your API, we get JSON objects and map them accordingly. That's pretty much straightforward. We will have a look at the controller. We need to override the build method, and we start with a simple null object we don't know at the moment, which person object to handle. And we add a logger information to know when this controller will be disposed. Of course, that's not necessary. We have a method editPerson where we set the data, the state, to the current person, which will be called on the edit button. And here we define a new person by simply putting the ID to -1. So once we press the edit button, we simply take this editPerson controller provider notifier. Remember, by reading the notifier, we have access to the methods and call editPerson with the person object of the row we are in at the moment. Hence, the state is changed to async data, and the editPersonForm watches the state of our editPerson controller. Here we show an empty container if it's null, we show loading if we're waiting for something, showing an error, and we show the form itself. And for the save button, we call the controller with the parameters as it is defined. And that's all the magic that is needed. For example, the delete method, where we delete the current person object. First, we call async loading a state to make sure the user does not press delete, 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 but sees the loading button as long as we communicate with the backend. And that depends on how you handle it. Here, I put async data to null after the person object was deleted and hide the form again because it's null now. As I've said earlier, to make sure that the list of people is updated, we need to invalidate this fetch people provider to force a refresh and hence a change in state and hence a redrawing, calling build method again of this part of the screen. If you debug the application, for example, set a breakpoint in the build method of the form to know when is it drawn, when is it executed again, you will realize, is it called twice because we have twice a change in state. We have first the async loading state and then the async data state. Try to understand the code in depth. So that was one way to address the problems described here. Of course, there are alternatives to do so, as always. You could separate the controller methods from the state itself. Another approach could be to handle how to set the state, how to set which person object I'm editing. For example, I could have a separate current person provider. That's basically a state provider. State provider we did not discuss so far. State provider simply provides a value. So there's no generation needed, it's just a state provider, and you could initialize it with null. Once you pressed the edit button or the plus sign, you could read this current person provider, access notifier. From this provider you access the state and set the state to the current person object. Again, your controller could have this state, and there you simply watch this current person provider with the state, or you separate the controller and the state as discussed in the first option. Another way could be you have a separate page for your editing and navigate to this page using a parameter like an ID. And in the init state method, you could initialize your controller with a separate method called init, and this gets the ID and calls then the repository provider to fetch a person object from the server with this ID. Nevertheless, I think this approach is easy to understand and to follow, and it's a good start. To end this episode, I want to sum up the usage of riverpod. Without the riverpod generator, we have the state provider to provide a single value. Using the generator, we have this function-based notation. For example, we used it to fetch the people and watch this provider in our list of all people. And we have this class-based approach for the controller. Within the widget, we can easily define our state and our controller using those providers. In the implementation of the controller, you will find this async value guard. It's a nice syntax to write less code with try and catch within your controller. And be aware of riverpod with a small r and riverpod with a capital R. For example, you could annotate riverpod keep alive true. So the state remains, the provider remains, even if there's no listener. Otherwise, it will be disposed automatically, which is the default and which works in most cases. And whenever you work with riverpod and its generator, and also if you work with the freest generator, make sure you have .pub1 build runner watch running in the background, so your generated files get updated automatically. That finishes our problem with the API. In the next video, we have a look at the navigation. See you then. Bye bye.